There are two kinds of power in the world. The first is loud. It shows up as speeches, sanctions, headlines, and confident gestures meant to make you feel safe because someone is in control. The second is quiet, and it doesn't care what you believe. It lives in valves, permits, supply chains, and the invisible materials that keep the machines of modern life from collapsing. Most people will watch this like it's a remote political drama. They'll argue about who won the last round, who blinked first, who is bluffing. But if you want the real story, you have to look where the leverage actually sits. And right now, the leverage is not in guns or slogans, it's in helium and rare earths. Two resources that behave like the hidden nervous system of technology. Control them, and you control the timing of the future. This video is about that uncomfortable truth. Global conflict today rarely starts with a battlefield. It starts with dependency. It starts with one country building an industry that cannot run without a particular cold gas or a specific rare mineral, and acting shocked when that dependency becomes a weapon. And here's the part society doesn't want you to notice. Even when the threats are just talk, people are still preparing their psychology for loss. Companies are reshuffling risk models. Governments are rewriting industrial priorities. Investors are pricing fear into every decision. That means the war is already happening. You're just not allowed to call it a war until someone damages something you can see. So let's go under the surface. Let's talk about helium first, because helium is not just a party trick. It is not just the gas in balloons. It is not decoration. It is the cold breath of labs, factories, hospitals, and defense systems that can't afford heat. And when one side believes it can close that valve, it means the other side is already feeling pressure in the place they thought was protected. People assume the world runs on patents, software, and intelligence. Sure, the West loves to tell that story. It flatters the ego. But modern technology is not powered by ego. It is powered by physical constraints. It is powered by extremely specific materials that have no good substitute, at least not at the speed the world demands. If you understand that, you understand why a single policy announcement can drop markets overnight, because underneath the drama is a simple math problem. If critical inputs stop moving, everything downstream freezes, even if nobody says the word collapse. You've probably heard about trade wars, but the deeper mechanism is psychological before it's economic. When governments threaten each other, they're not only trying to change behavior, they're training you to predict failure. They're teaching companies to doubt their own continuity. They're pressuring workers to believe their jobs are temporary. They're forcing elites to keep scanning for the next disaster. That kind of fear is a resource too, because it makes everyone react faster than they think. Now imagine that fear concentrated around one substance, helium. Helium behaves like liquid discipline. It enables ultra-cold environments needed for certain manufacturing steps, for superconducting systems, and for equipment where temperature stability decides whether a machine works or breaks. In chip manufacturing, especially processes involving advanced lithography, extreme cooling can be the difference between a usable output and a destroyed precision tool. In medical imaging, like MRI machines, helium helps maintain the superconducting magnets that make high-resolution diagnostics possible. In defense contexts, superconductivity and cryogenic systems show up where performance depends on maintaining specific physical states. If you control the cold gas, you control the heartbeat of infrastructure. And the brutal truth is this: the country that holds that heartbeat doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to threaten every day. It just needs to have options. Options create leverage. Leverage creates compliance. Compliance is what actually ends wars, not treaties. For years, helium has been a dependence the world pretended was harmless. That's what people do when they don't want to feel vulnerable. They wrap dependence in normal routines. They call it market supply. They call it globalization. They pretend the pipeline is permanent. They pretend because if they admit otherwise, they'd have to confront the fact that their entire industrial confidence is borrowed. But industrial confidence is never truly yours. It belongs to whoever can interrupt it with the least effort and the highest plausible deniability. This is where the story of US influence and Chinese countermoves gets dark and personal. The dynamic isn't just America does X, China does Y. It's that both sides know exactly how much the other side needs, and both sides hate needing anything. Nations act like proud predators, but they're still vulnerable creatures, and vulnerability invites control. When China faced restrictions in rare earth exports, it wasn't only an economic headache, it was a humiliation of infrastructure. Rare earths are essential for permanent magnets, radar systems, electric vehicle motors, high-tech sensors, and guidance systems. You can't just replace them overnight with a new supplier. The supply chain is embedded in decades of extraction, processing, refining, and specialization. So China treated rare earths like a strategic lever. The logic was straightforward. If the US or allies can choke inputs through export policy, then China should be able to choke inputs too. But there's a psychological twist that matters. The lever you hold isn't only useful for retaliation, it's useful for forcing the other side into uncertainty. You don't have to pull the lever, you just make the other side imagine pulling it. That's why the world talks about threats. But threats are not only statements. Threats are rehearsals. They teach the counterpart to assume you might act. And once the counterpart assumes that, every planning meeting becomes more cautious. Every budget becomes more conservative. Every procurement becomes more expensive. That is how pressure works. Not through explosions, but through delays. Now, China was watching another problem: helium dependence. Rare earths are muscle. Helium is breath. Muscle can be retrained slowly. Breath can be cut quickly. Helium is the kind of dependency that creates a countdown feeling. It's the difference between a slowdown and a stoppage. And if you've ever lived through personal dependence, you understand this instantly. It's the same mechanism in relationships, too. One person holds something you need emotionally, materially, socially, medically, or professionally. The other person starts pretending they're fine because admitting need would feel humiliating. But inside, there's a silent dread. That dread changes behavior. You start adapting. You stop demanding. You become careful with your words. You become obedient without calling it obedience. That's how nations behave when they're dependent. That's how markets behave when they're dependent. That's how entire ecosystems of companies behave when the input is uncertain. In the geopolitical transcript of the real world, helium becomes the mirror. China can endure rare earth pressure because it has some room to substitute, some room to plan. But helium is closer to break the system territory. If the valve is closed, certain industries don't just lose profit, they lose function, they freeze like metal. So China began building autonomy quietly, not with big press conferences, with machines, plants, and technical capacity. This is an important detail psychologically. Autonomy is not built through pride. Autonomy is built through boring execution. It's built by engineers and process design and large-scale investment, while everyone else argues in media cycles. This is the part people don't want to hear because it ruins the narrative. The narrative says power equals talking louder, but real power equals doing the work no one wants to watch. When China moved toward helium self-sufficiency, it wasn't only a technical achievement, it was a psychological transformation from reactive dependence to proactive control. And when you watch that happen, you realize something uncomfortable. The world's loud conflict often follows after years of hidden preparation. Everyone thinks they're witnessing the beginning, but most of the time they're only seeing the moment the prepared strategy finally meets the prepared response. Then the story escalates. Russia enters the helium chessboard. Energy alliances form where ideology would normally be supposed to block cooperation. That's another uncomfortable truth. In real industrial strategy, ideology is not the main character. Supply is. Russia has helium resources concentrated in regions like eastern Siberia and the Far East. The difference between resource exists and resource can be used at scale is technology and infrastructure. So China brought the technology and capability. Russia brought the raw helium potential. Together, they built a pipeline that doesn't only supply a gas, it supplies time, it supplies insurance, and that matters because time is what prevents panic. Panic makes leaders irrational, it makes firms accept bad deals, it makes societies split. Time makes resistance possible. When China created helium capacity and alliances that reduce U.S. leverage, the world didn't see it immediately because the story wasn't dramatic. But inside, the industrial clock changed. A valve that could have been closed became harder to close. A dependency that could have been used for coercion became less effective. And then, as the capability matured, policy followed. This is how controlled escalation works. Build first, threaten later. Because once you threaten without capability, you look weak. Nations and corporations both know that humiliation is expensive. In this case, the move wasn't only about helium anymore. It was about coordination. It was about coupling helium capacity with broader control of rare earths. In one scenario, you tighten helium access. In another, you restrict rare earth export licenses. Together, those tools can create a two-direction choke. You can constrain the opponent's production, and you can also ensure your own industries keep breathing. This is why the transcript emphasizes control, not just possession. Possessing a resource is not the same as controlling the supply. Control includes extraction, refining, liquefaction, storage, logistics, processing permits, and the ability to redirect or delay shipments without triggering catastrophic legal exposure. Control also includes timing. It includes the ability to keep your own factories stable while forcing the opponent to guess your future moves. That timing is a form of power that resembles emotional manipulation in personal life. Someone with emotional control doesn't need to explode. They just need to respond inconsistently, delay, or remove access in ways that keep you uncertain. You start overthinking, you start bargaining, you start changing yourself. That's not love, that's conditioning. Now translate that into industry. The companies believe shipments might be delayed due to licensing approvals. They stop relying on just-in-time planning. They build redundant inventory. That costs money. It ties up capital. It slows growth. It creates friction that looks like market turbulence, but is actually psychological conditioning of the supply chain. And when you're conditioned, you behave differently. You choose suppliers differently. You restructure contracts. You create alternative ecosystems. Some of those ecosystems eventually become alliances. This is what China was doing. Not only building a helium system, it was also building parallel supply routes and long-term partnerships that could survive political storms. That is why the transcript mentions countries like Kazakhstan and Qatar signing long-term contracts, forming what you could call a cold energy alliance. It's not just about gas, it's about building a network that keeps critical industries alive even if US-led logistics or sanctions pressure intensifies. The transcript then moves into a newer phase. After years of preparation, the action becomes visible. Export controls expand. Rare earth licensing becomes more stringent, not only for raw materials, but also for intermediate processing steps if technologies from certain sources are involved. In other words, the control is layered. It's hard to bypass. It forces third countries and third-party manufacturers into the same decision dilemma: comply with the licensing authority or redesign your entire production process, which takes years. And that is where the psychological war becomes clear. It's not only a trade restriction, it's a forced redesign of reality. Businesses are forced to accept that their assumptions about supply are unstable. That creates a particular kind of fear, the fear that your future is not fully under your control. That fear becomes a political tool. When businesses fear, they lobby. When they lobby, they pressure politicians. When politicians respond, policy shifts. That is how a gas can become a geopolitical lever. Then the transcript describes an American policy response involving tariffs and broad import taxation. This is the typical pattern. One side increases restrictions, the other side increases costs. Markets react violently because economic systems hate uncertainty, especially when their planning horizon collapses. But the important detail is how China responds emotionally. not with shouting, with calm declarations about protecting legal rights by necessary means. That calmness is also a psychological strategy. It communicates that the opponent should not expect emotional escalation. It communicates that the other side is ready for long duration. Long duration is what most people underestimate. People love the drama of sudden moves, but survival in these conflicts is about patience. It's about whether you can endure losses longer than the opponent can endure costs. It's about whether your domestic industries can keep running while the other side's industries are destabilized. This is why the transcript frames 2025 as rain starts to fall. The earlier years were thunder and lightning. The threats were loud, but action was delayed. Action now arrives with export licensing, port fees, and internal prioritization for domestic industries. That combination is also psychologically potent because it forces the opponent into two kinds of stress at once: supply stress and cost stress. For companies connected to the U.S., special port fees double logistics costs. They face additional security checks. That means delays and higher costs. It's not necessarily about blocking every shipment. It's about making every shipment harder, slower, and more expensive. That gradually erodes competitiveness. It also teaches firms that operating in the ecosystem may have hidden costs. On the other side, domestic industries receive priority funding and export allowances. That means China can keep its strategic sectors moving. The opponent can't. This is not fair competition. It's industrial triage. It is choosing winners by political design. In a market, winners emerge from efficiency. In a controlled strategic environment, winners emerge from access. And if you've ever felt like you were competing in a game where the rules quietly change depending on who the referee likes, you understand the emotional depth here. That feeling is not just frustration, it's a loss of agency. It breaks trust in the system. Once trust breaks, people either withdraw or fight. In geopolitical terms, when trust breaks, nations build autonomy. They build alternative supply chains. They diversify partners. They stop relying on a single gatekeeper. So now we reach the deeper message. Modern power is no longer just about GDP or bombs. It's about the materials that keep the machinery alive. In the 20th century, oil dominated imagination because oil is visible. It fuels engines. It fuels everything people picture. In the 21st century, the imagination is behind the reality. The real fuel of high-tech civilization includes helium and rare earths, superconducting inputs and magnetic components, cryogenic systems, and precision manufacturing materials. This is why the transcript compares helium to cold blood of industry. That metaphor is brutal because it's true. Blood is what keeps you alive while you don't think about it. You don't appreciate blood until it stops moving. Helium is like that. It is the cold blood that moves through the body of modern manufacturing. It keeps MRI systems running for diagnosis and research. It keeps particle accelerators active in labs. It keeps cryogenic superconducting networks stable. And for advanced chips, those manufacturing environments need extreme conditions to deliver precision at scale. If you want to understand why this becomes a weapon, think about how fragile life becomes when blood stops. It doesn't matter how strong your muscles are. It doesn't matter how smart your mind is. Without circulation, the body fails. Now apply that to global manufacturing. Without helium access, factories either stop or produce with degraded performance. Either way, the opponent gains time while the production slows. Time is leverage. On the rare earth side, the metaphor shifts to nerves. Rare earths enable magnets, radar sensors, motors, and guidance. Nerves carry signals. Without them, the systems become blind, clumsy, and inaccurate. You can still move, but you lose coordination. So helium is breath, and rare earths are nerves. Put them together and you understand the transcript's core claim. Control these inputs, and you control the rhythm and perception of technological civilization. Now, I want to push this beyond geopolitics and into psychology, because this channel exists for uncomfortable self-recognition. People watch these conflicts and think, good, bad, winners, losers, but the hidden mechanism is dependency and leverage, and that's not only happening between nations, you have experienced it in smaller forms. In your job, someone had access to your promotion pipeline. In your relationship, someone had the emotional attachment you needed to feel stable. In your finances, someone controlled the credit terms and interest rates you couldn't negotiate. In your identity, someone's approval was the gate you couldn't open yourself. You adapted until you stopped recognizing your own boundaries. The transcript describes China moving from dependence to autonomy. That's the same psychological arc a person needs to take when they've been living under the hidden control of someone else's permissions. Autonomy isn't a mood, it's capacity. It's having enough skills, resources, alternatives, and support networks that a single gatekeeper can't throttle your life. Most people never build that autonomy. They